I'm thinking of the incredible breakthrough which has been made possible by developments in communications, particularly the transistor and, above all, the communications satellite. These things will make possible a world in which we can be in instant contact with each other, wherever we may be, where we can contact our friends anywhere on Earth, even if we don't know their actual physical location.
Computers used to be big. Huge, massive rooms full of computers, taking hours to process what takes computers today nanoseconds. In 1960, 5 megabytes of data storage looked like this. For comparison, this GIF of a spinning sandwich is 6 megabytes, and you could store 12,500 spinning sandwich GIFs on my outdated 75 gigabyte hard drive from 2014. Most modern computers have more than a terabyte of storage. That's over 166,000 sandwich GIFs. It took a very long time for scientists to process all of the data from their experiments. Except not every scientist used their sandwich GIF processing computers all of the time. So MIT computer scientist Joseph Licklider had the smart idea of linking all of these computers together. When one computer wasn't being used, all the others could connect to it and use the computing power to do their own calculations. They couldn't just make it happen. There were computers all over the world in universities and laboratories. How do you connect computers over vast distances? And where do you get the money to do this? Since 1958, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, a subsection of the Department of Defense, has funded experimental technologies in the hope that they can be used for military purposes. They wanted a network that could easily connect intelligence agencies all over the world and get the upper hand over the Russians. And if getting that required them to send a few million to some nerdy programmers every year, then so be it. The system devised was the ARPANET, which would use the existing phone lines as a way to transmit data, and anyone with a computer connected to the ARPANET could send data through the network. All over the USA, colleges and research labs began installing computers to connect to the ARPANET, with a maximum download speed of 100 kilobits per second. That's 8 minutes to transmit a spinning sandwich GIF, but it's still faster than sending everything by mail. Meanwhile, in France, government scientists working on the Cyclades program focused on connecting computers to each other directly through a network of wires, very similar to the ARPANET. They called this idea l'Ethernet. And in Britain, scientists at the National Physics Laboratory invented a way to transmit data more quickly, break it up into tiny pieces that travel across the least busy networks and then rearrange themselves at the other end. These things are pretty cool, but what if we could have all of them together? Let's make some sort of internet protocol address, so the information you send from one computer network can travel along the other networks like the French and British networks. And this was the start of the internet. You can share processing power across the world through data cables and satellites. But there still wasn't a way for you to ask permission to use someone else's computer power. You could only ever talk to other users on the same network using a program called SDBSG. In 1971, Ray Tomlinson found a solution to this by taking the code allowing you to send data to other networks and adding it to the SDBSG feature. So, email. Now you can communicate with other computer nerds all over the country, and immediately use it to buy weed. Networks like Usenet and Gopher acted as sort of proto-websites where users could upload and share files while also viewing news and communicating with like-minded people on topics like computers, music, video games, living in South Wales, and wait, does that say rape? New ways to waste time were invented. Message boards, news sites, virtual Dungeons and Dragons, and online shopping. Aside from weed, one of the earliest things bought online was some groceries by a 72-year-old woman in Newcastle in 1984, who had used a computer provided by the local council to have food delivered to her home. This era also gave rise to many of the slang we still use online today, like spam, flame war, trolling, thread, phone companies began seeing the potential profit that could be made by selling people access to their phone lines to send Usenet messages. Many of them started offering internet access with their phone plans, while entirely new companies were created to cash in on the emerging technology. Most of this actually happened behind the scenes. For the longest time, the public remained mostly unaware of the internet's existence. It was only students, professors, and scientists who had any access to the technology. And it's easy to see why. The internet wasn't built for normal people, it was built for nerds. Information was displayed as horrible, ugly chunks of text that filled the screen and were hard to read. Navigating between countless menus with only a keyboard was a nightmare. That's why in 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, a scientist working at CERN, invented a visual interface system that allowed scientists to share information and research papers more easily. Digital resources would be given uniform locators that could be linked together so you could jump over the massive menu interfaces instead of having to navigate through them all. It's like hyperspace from Star Wars, but with text. A sort of hyperlink. Now the internet was less like a maze and more like a world wide web. Hey, that's a cool... The technology was made public in 1991, and Mr. Berners-Lee now spends the rest of his life trying to convince companies and governments not to ruin this amazing invention. But the World Wide Web wasn't the only digital information system. There were competitors that the web had to fight off. Remember the French? Since the 1980s, the French government had been sending one of these things for free to every telephone subscriber in the country. Médium interactif par numériste d'information téléphonique. Companies and organizations could set up their own servers that any user could connect to and receive information from. Timetables, restaurant reservations, stock prices, chat rooms, online games, ordering groceries. It was so commonplace that even the elderly were doing it. But not everyone is French, thankfully, and because Minitel was owned by the French government, there was little incentive to expand the program outside of the country. This gave the web a unique advantage. It had no borders, was also free, no telephone subscription required, and had a graphical user interface, which was way easier to use than the terminal interface. You could also upload images and larger files. You didn't even need to register your service with the French government. You just plugged your server to the internet and anyone with a web browser could access your stuff. The number of websites and people with internet access ballooned massively starting in 1993, much to the dismay of the nerds who had developed a local culture on the network. Minitel and other World Wide Web competitors couldn't keep up and were eventually shut down. But that's probably a good thing. Trying to get all of your friends on one social media or video game console is hard enough. Be glad you don't have to get everyone onto the same version of the internet. And from there you had MySpace, Google, Something Awful forums, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Spotify, Twitch, online games, remote surgery, cars controlled by rat brains, schizophrenic programmers, and Newgrounds. More undersea cables than ever before in history were laid down to keep up with the demand for ever-increasing internet speeds. In 20 years, the most powerful brands in the world went from a soft drink company and a car manufacturer to Google and Amazon. Entire swathes of California have been reserved for bearded tech bros and rich morons with overvalued startups. Now there's internet in your pocket, on your finger, in your doorbell, in your shoes, in your juicer, in your fucking salt grinder. Who knows where they're going to put the internet next? Like any other machine, it can be a benefit or a hazard. It can draw us together, or it can make us slaves. So use the internet wisely, and be thankful for the coalition of Stoner College students, CIA agents, French nerds, and an English programmer who worked together to make it all possible.